Imagine for a moment that everything you've ever heard about Jesus Christ, the miracles, the crowds, the words that changed the world, wasn't just faith or tradition. Imagine if there were evidence, real traces, historical documents, archaeological finds and external testimonies that clearly proved that he really did walk this earth. What if Jesus' footprints weren't just in the pages of the Bible, but also set in stone, written on ancient papyri, and confirmed by historians who didn't even believe in him? Prepare yourself, because what you're going to hear now isn't preaching. It's an investigation, a deep journey full of details that begins with a simple question and ends with a revelation that could change the way you see history and perhaps your own life. For centuries, critics have said that Jesus was a myth, a religious construct created to unite peoples or control the masses. But there's a problem with this theory. The more archaeologists excavate the soil of the Middle East, the more historians analyze ancient manuscripts, the more they find echoes of a man who really lived, taught, and split history in half. And the question that won't go away is, why do Roman documents, which had nothing to gain from publicizing Jesus, mention his trial, his crucifixion, and even the effects of his followers on the cities? Why did non-Christian writers like Flavius, Josephus, and Tacitus mention Jesus in their records? None of them had faith in Jesus, and yet they all wrote about him. That's not doctrine, that's evidence. That's history. In this video, you won't just hear what the Christians say. We're going to explore what skeptics, archaeologists, original manuscripts from the 1st century, physical finds, and the official records of the Roman Empire say. You'll learn about the papyrus that may contain one of the oldest mentions of Jesus' words. You'll see a letter from a governor who, in desperation, asks Rome what to do with those followers of a man called Christ who had the courage to die for him. You'll see dates, names, documents, and most importantly, you'll understand why, even after 2,000 years, no other figure in history has as much proof, as much influence, and as much resistance as this man. And the question comes back, why? Stay until the end of this video, because what follows is not religious repetition, it's historical revelation. In each part of this journey, you will come into contact with sources ignored by many and unknown by others. Facts that have been buried by time, but which today, with technology, can be analyzed and revealed like never before. And if you already believed in Jesus, this journey will strengthen your faith. But if you had any doubts, maybe they'll start to crumble now. Don't jump, don't go any further, because part 2 begins by revealing the oldest historical documents that mention Jesus, and what they say may surprise you. In the heart of the Roman Empire, where records were coldly kept and names were only written down when they meant something to the state, a strange figure appeared in the annals of history, Jesus, called Christ. He wasn't an emperor, he wasn't a general, he didn't command armies or have palaces, but his name appears in the writings of figures such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger. Men who were not Jews, men who were not Christians, men who had no reason to invent the existence of a prophet executed in a remote province. The Roman historian Tacitus, for example, writing some 80 years after the death of Jesus, reports that the Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, and he clearly mentions Christ, who suffered the death penalty during the reign of Tiberius under the rule of Pontius Pilate. Why would a man like Tacitus, known for his historical accuracy and coolness, write this? Why would he mention a simple preacher of a despised religion if it wasn't something documented and real? In another part of the empire, Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, writes to Emperor Trajan asking for guidance. He is confused, almost disturbed, because hundreds of citizens gather in secret before dawn to sing hymns to a certain Christ, as if he were a god. Men and women who refuse to deny their faith, even under threat of death. Pliny doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how anyone could be willing to die for a man who was supposedly crucified decades before. But the letter is clear. These followers existed. The cult of Jesus was real, and more importantly, it was strong enough to attract official attention from the Roman government. We are no longer talking about sacred texts. We're talking about state archives, historical records, evidence, and there's more. Suetonius, another Roman historian, mentions that Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome because of constant riots instigated by one Chrestus, a probable reference to Christ. This document is important because it shows that, as early as 49 AD, the name of Jesus was causing political unrest, even in the heart of the empire. Faith in his figure was already strong, divisive, and impactful. Remember, all this is said by men who were not Christians. They weren't writing to promote Jesus. They were simply reporting what they saw, with discomfort, with skepticism, but with precision. And what they saw was a real phenomenon, an explosive movement arising from the figure of a man they themselves recognized as having been executed by Pontius Pilate. These accounts don't come from monks hiding in monasteries. They are official documents, preserved in museums, universities, and libraries all over the world. Evidence that has undergone centuries of analysis, translation, and criticism, and they all point in the same direction. Jesus of Nazareth was not a myth created centuries later. His name was already mentioned in the decades immediately after his death. His impact was already felt in the highest echelons of power. What's more, his followers were willing to die for him, something that no follower would do for a myth, a fable, or an invention. If Jesus were just a legend, it would be logical for his name to disappear from history. But the opposite happened. His presence grew, it spread, and the more Rome tried to erase his name, the stronger it became. That's not common. This is unique, and we've only just begun, because now that you've seen what Rome said about Jesus, it's time to get to know the words that one of the greatest Jewish historians recorded, a man who lived close to the time of the apostles, a man who saw the effects of Christ, even without being a follower of his. His name is Flavius Josephus, and what he wrote could change everything. Flavius Josephus was a first-century Jewish historian, a man who was born in Jerusalem, lived through the turbulence of the fall of the temple, and recorded the history of his people in detail. His work is one of the most important non-Christian sources on the context in which Jesus lived. In his writings, especially in the book Jewish Antiquities, there are passages that mention Jesus clearly. Although some controversies about possible later editions exist, most scholars agree that the original core is authentic and relevant. Josephus describes Jesus as a wise man, if one can call him a man, for he did astonishing deeds, a teacher of those who gladly receive the truth. He reports that Jesus was crucified by Pilate, but that his fame didn't disappear. His followers continued to be active to the point of forming a strong community that impacted the history of Judaism and the world. This testimony is fundamental because it comes from someone who was not a Christian, but a Pharisee and a novelist of history, offering an outsider's view of the Jesus phenomenon. In addition, Josephus mentions James, who was called Jesus' brother, which further reinforces the real existence of a central historical figure. Another important detail is that Josephus was not a Christian. He had his own beliefs and political motivations, but even so, he didn't hesitate to recognize the impact of the man called Jesus, who stirred up the religious and political system of the time. His texts have been preserved in ancient manuscripts that have been discovered and analyzed over the centuries, and their authenticity, although debated, is widely accepted by serious historians. Josephus's account creates a bridge between Roman records and Christian texts, showing a continuous line of historical recognition of Jesus' existence without the need for faith, just critical and historical analysis. In addition, Josephus also recounts events related to the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem, contexts that help us to better understand the era in which Jesus lived and how his ideas directly influenced the culture and conflicts of that time. By placing Jesus in this real setting, he distances himself from the legends and places the character at the center of tangible historical facts. This is a crucial point for anyone seeking to understand Jesus, not just as a religious figure, but as a person who really existed, lived, suffered, and had such an impact that it continues to this day. While many ancient documents have disappeared, what remains of the writings of Flavius Josephus is one of the most precious keys to unlocking the door to the true story behind the myth. His work confirms that Jesus was more than just an idea or a tale to feed a faith. He was a character who challenged the established powers and left traces that still stand today. And these traces are not only in Bibles, but also in libraries around the world. Now that we've seen the historical records of Rome and the writings of Josephus, the next step is to delve into archaeology, physical evidence, artifacts, real sites that confirm that the story of Jesus is not restricted to ancient books, but lives in the very soil of the Holy Land. It's an investigation that goes beyond paper and straight into tangible reality. Modern archaeology has uncovered impressive secrets that confirm many details of the context in which Jesus lived and which help to reinforce his historical existence. Excavations in cities such as Nazareth, Capernaum, Jerusalem, and Qumran have brought to light traces of buildings, inscriptions, and objects that prove the presence of a vibrant and complex Jewish community, exactly as described in biblical and historical accounts. For example, in Nazareth, where Jesus is said to have grown up, archaeologists have found the remains of first-century houses, including domestic utensils and ceramics, confirming that this small village really existed and was inhabited by ordinary people, exactly as tradition points out. In addition, one of the most fascinating finds is the stone inscription found in the region, which mentions the title Nazarene, used to designate the followers of Jesus, something that until then seemed just a religious term, but which has gained physical evidence showing that this designation was actually known and used at that time. In Capernaum, the city where Jesus would have ministered for much of his ministry, archaeologists have discovered the ruins of an ancient synagogue from the 1st century with stones inscribed in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, and which is also mentioned in the Gospels. This confirms that the accounts of his preaching in synagogues are not mere narrative, but part of the reality of that time. Another striking example comes from Jerusalem, where inscriptions, coins, and documents have been discovered that reinforce the descriptions of the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion. The excavation at Golgotha, the place of the skull, where tradition has it that Jesus was crucified, has revealed archaeological evidence that indicates that this was indeed a Roman execution site used for public punishments. Bone remains and objects have also been found that confirm the funerary customs of the time, in line with the accounts of the empty tombs and resurrection that are central to the Christian narrative. In addition to the sites, the discoveries of manuscripts at Qumran, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls, although they don't directly mention Jesus, show the extremely complex and tense religious, political, and social environment in which he lived. These documents reveal the beliefs, messianic expectations, and internal divisions of Judaism at that time, giving more context for understanding the impact that Jesus had in claiming to be the Messiah, something that profoundly altered history. All this not only confirms the existence of Jesus as a real historical figure, but also supports the narrative of his life, ministry, death, and the movement he sparked. The stones, the papyri, the coins, the ruins, these are proofs that go hand in hand with the historical and religious texts, reinforcing that this is not a made-up story, but an account of events that left a real mark on the world. The next part will delve into the role of Jesus' first followers, the origins of Christianity, and how documents written by them help to further prove its existence. After Jesus' death, his followers began to record his life, teachings, and miracles in documents that we know today as the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament. These texts, written within a few decades of his crucifixion, are not mere fanciful stories, but the records of eyewitnesses and members of the first Christian communities. The authenticity and temporal proximity of these documents are crucial to understanding that they were not written centuries later, but in a historical context very close to the facts. These writings detail not only the life of Jesus, but also reflect the struggles and dilemmas faced by his followers, who lived under constant threat, persecution, and even death because of their faith in him. The apostles, such as Peter and Paul, were central figures in spreading this faith and writing letters that today form part of the biblical canon. Paul, in particular, wrote his epistles between 20 and 30 years after Jesus' death, and in none of them does he question Jesus' existence. On the contrary, he talks about events, teachings, and interactions with people who knew Jesus personally. This is important because Paul never met him before his crucifixion, but his letter reveals an absolute certainty of the existence and historical impact of this man. The epistles are historical documents, full of social, cultural, and theological details, which confirm the existence of a real community made up of people who lived and witnessed the events described. In addition, the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written with the aim of preserving the memory of Jesus for future generations. Each of them brings a distinct but convergent perspective, reinforcing fundamental details of Jesus' life and death. These narratives were so influential and widespread so early on that the Roman Empire came to consider Christianity a growing threat, a fact that appears in later Roman documents. The rapid circulation of these texts and the dizzying growth of the Christian movement indicate that the story of Jesus was known and accepted by many, even outside the circle of his followers. Another essential point is that, unlike other legendary historical figures whose stories have been widely distorted over time, Jesus' life is surrounded by multiple independent accounts written in different regions by different authors who share common essential elements. This textual convergence strengthens the idea that Jesus was a real person who profoundly influenced the history of the world. The next part will look at evidence from ancient manuscripts and how modern textual analysis contributes to the historical proof of Jesus Christ. The ancient manuscripts of the New Testament are some of the most powerful evidence for the historical existence of Jesus Christ. With thousands of fragments and copies scattered around the world, these ancient documents reveal that the texts about Jesus were transmitted with an impressive degree of fidelity over the centuries. One of the oldest manuscripts, Papyrus 52, dating from the early 2nd century, contains a fragment of the Gospel of John, showing that already a few decades after Jesus' death, his words were being recorded and disseminated. The quantity and antiquity of these manuscripts are incomparable to any other ancient text, which strengthens the reliability of the narratives about Jesus. In addition to the quantity, the quality of the manuscripts allows scholars to compare versions, detect minimal changes, and reconstruct the original text with high precision. This textual analysis shows that the accounts of Jesus were not the fruit of an unstable oral tradition, but of carefully preserved documents. Unlike many legends that are quickly lost or transformed, the Christian texts were the subject of intense concern to maintain their integrity, reflecting the importance that the first Christians gave to the words and life of Jesus. Another crucial point is that these manuscripts were found in different regions, such as Egypt, Syria, and Greece, which demonstrates the wide dissemination of the stories of Jesus in different cultures and languages. This geographical diffusion is a strong indication that Jesus was not just a local or mythological character, but a figure recognized and discussed in various real communities. This creates a robust historical scenario where the written evidence converges to confirm Jesus' existence and influence. In addition to Christian manuscripts, non-Christian records, such as those of Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny, also mention Jesus or his followers, providing external testimonies that corroborate the figure's historicity. These accounts are valuable because they come from sources that had no interest in promoting Christianity, but which recognized its presence and impact on the Roman Empire. This independence reinforces the credibility of Jesus' real existence as a historical figure. Finally, the science of textual criticism continues to advance, bringing new discoveries and reaffirming that, despite the natural variations in ancient documents, the core of the message and the basic facts about Jesus remain intact. This manuscript evidence is a solid basis for any serious historical analysis of the existence of Jesus Christ. In addition to ancient manuscripts, the study of non-Christian texts from the 1st and 2nd centuries is fundamental to proving the existence of Jesus. Roman historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger mention Jesus or his followers in their writings without any connection to the Christian faith, demonstrating that the figure of Jesus was known and relevant to the Roman Empire. Tacitus, for example, in his Annals, reports that Christ was executed by Pontius Pilate during the rule of Tiberius, confirming the historical context of the crucifixion. This reference is especially important because it comes from a historian who had no reason to validate Christian beliefs, only to record events from the past. Suetonius, for his part, mentions disturbances caused by followers of Chrestus, a probable reference to Christ, which shows that the Christian movement was already having a social and political impact in ancient Rome. Pliny the Younger, ruling the province of Bithynia, wrote letters to Emperor Trajan questioning how to treat Christians, describing them as worshippers of Christ. These external sources complement the Christian accounts, showing that Jesus was not just a myth, but a historical figure recognized by his contemporaries and adversaries. This external evidence is crucial because it eliminates the possibility of Jesus being a late invention or a simple legend. They demonstrate that even outside the circle of his followers, he was an influential enough personality to be recorded in the official annals of the Roman Empire. The direct mention of his trial and execution reinforces the biblical accounts, offering independent historical validation. Another aspect worth highlighting is the consensus among serious historians and academics who study the period, who recognize Jesus as a real historical figure, even though there are differences over theological interpretations. The convergence of Christian and non-Christian sources creates a network of evidence that confirms his existence far beyond the religious sphere, as a man who lived, taught, was crucified, and whose life generated a movement that changed the world. With these sources in hand, we can understand that the historical evidence about Jesus is not based on faith alone, but on reliable documents and accounts, many of them written by people who had no interest in creating a religion, but who recognized the importance of this man. The next stage will explore the cultural and social impact of Jesus' life and how this further confirms his real existence. The cultural and social impact of the life of Jesus Christ is one of the strongest indirect proofs of his real existence and his transformative role in human history. The rapid expansion of Christianity, starting with a small group of followers in Jerusalem and growing to become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and later of the Western world, would not be explained if Jesus were a fictional figure. This extraordinary growth took place in a context of great political, social, and religious resistance, including severe persecutions that would have easily extinguished a movement with no real basis. The social transformations brought about by Christianity included profound changes in the values, laws, and power structures of the time, influencing ethics, morals, and collective behavior. The fact that Christianity promoted a message of love, forgiveness, and hope for the marginalized and oppressed shows that the influence of Jesus and his teachings was more than just theoretical. It had a real and tangible impact on people's lives. This cultural change is indirect evidence of the existence of someone who inspired such a social revolution. In addition, the oral traditions, testimonies, and rituals preserved by various communities around the world attest to the fact that Jesus was not an isolated character, but a historical figure who mobilized thousands of people in his time. The fact that these traditions have been maintained, transmitted, and preserved with such care over the centuries reinforces the existence of a real founder whose life and work were remarkable and undeniable for his followers. Another important point is the continuing influence of the figure of Jesus on the arts, literature, politics, and philosophy, which has lasted for more than 2,000 years. This continuous influence would be meaningless if Jesus were just a legend. The depth and breadth of this impact point to a concrete existence which has generated an invaluable legacy. Western culture, and many others around the world, have been shaped by the life and teachings of Jesus Christ, demonstrating that he was not just a character, but a real person who transformed history. The next part will deal with archaeological and historical evidence related to sites and artifacts that further reinforce the existence of Jesus, bringing concrete evidence of the environment in which he lived. Archaeological evidence is another fundamental pillar for confirming the existence of Jesus Christ within the historical context in which he lived. Over the last few centuries, various excavations in Jerusalem, Nazareth, and other regions of Palestine have revealed artifacts, inscriptions, and structures that correspond to the descriptions found in the Gospels. For example, the discovery of the Pool of Bethesda, mentioned in the Gospel of John, or the house of Caiaphas, the high priest who condemned Jesus, are tangible pieces of evidence that confirm the historical accuracy of the biblical accounts. These findings show that the environment in which Jesus lived and acted is real and can be studied scientifically. In addition, stone inscriptions and ancient papyri that mention historical figures linked to the life of Jesus, such as Pontius Pilate, reinforce that the characters who interacted with him were real and ruled the regions in specific periods. Pilate's existence was confirmed by an inscription found in Caesarea Maritima, bringing to light a historical fact that had previously been questioned. This archaeological confirmation aligns directly with the biblical accounts, consolidating the credibility of the texts that speak of Jesus' life and death. Another important archaeological aspect are the finds related to the first Christian communities. Graves, places of worship, and inscriptions in catacombs demonstrate the rapid organization and significant presence of these groups from the 1st century onwards. These archaeological remains attest to the fact that the Christian movement was born out of a real, charismatic figure, capable of mobilizing the faithful and creating solid religious traditions from a very early stage. This material evidence, combined with the historical sources, builds a robust basis for proving the historical existence of Jesus. Finally, archaeology also helps to put 1st century Palestine into context, detailing customs, religious practices, social and political conditions of the time. This setting helps to better understand the environment in which Jesus lived and ministered, making his story more plausible and integrated with the reality of that period. The archaeological finds not only confirm specific details, but also strengthen the veracity of the historical framework in which Jesus was placed. The testimonies of Jesus' first eyewitnesses are one of the most valuable elements in proving his historical existence. Many of the apostles and direct followers of Jesus left written records, accounts, and letters that have been preserved over the centuries, forming the basis of the Gospels and epistles of the New Testament. These texts are not only faith narratives, but also historical documents that reflect personal experiences and concrete details of Jesus' life and ministry, written by people who knew him directly. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by authors who were close to the events they recounted, or to people who were close to Jesus. Mark, for example, is considered to be Peter's disciple, while Luke was a doctor and careful historian who interviewed eyewitnesses. The consistency between these accounts, despite being written by different authors at different times, reinforces the authenticity of the events described. This historical proximity makes it difficult to create an elaborate and consistent myth. Furthermore, Paul's letters, written even before the Gospels, contain direct references to Jesus, his birth, death, and resurrection, as well as details of the first Christian communities. Paul was not an eyewitness, but received his teachings directly from people who lived with Jesus. His epistles are considered some of the oldest Christian documents, dating back to the 50s AD, which shows that the memory of Jesus was alive and central to these early groups just a few years after his crucifixion. Another important point is that these early witnesses faced persecution and political persecution, and many of the first Christians were martyred for maintaining their faith in the existence and resurrection of Jesus. This willingness to suffer and die for a cause suggests that these followers believed deeply in the reality of the events they affirmed. They would not do this for a made-up fable, but for an experience that transformed their lives forever. Therefore, the testimonies of the first eyewitnesses not only provide precious historical information, but also confirm that Jesus was a real person who profoundly impacted his followers, generating a movement that endures to this day. A frequently discussed point in proving the existence of Jesus Christ are the accounts of his crucifixion, a historical event widely accepted by scholars and historians, regardless of religious beliefs. Crucifixion was a Roman method of execution reserved for criminals, rebels, and those considered a threat to public order. Various sources, both Christian and non-Christian, confirm that Jesus was sentenced to death by crucifixion under the rule of Pontius Pilate, making this an undisputed milestone in his history. The Gospel accounts describe details of the process leading up to the crucifixion, including the trial by Pilate, the accusations made by the Jewish leaders, and the road Jesus traveled to Calvary. Despite the differences in detail between the Gospels, the crucifixion as the central event is unanimously confirmed. This consensus between multiple sources makes it unlikely that the crucifixion is an invention or exaggeration, reinforcing Jesus' historical existence. In addition to Christian texts, Roman historians such as Tacitus mention the crucifixion of Jesus in their writings, reinforcing the existence of this event. Tacitus describes how Christ suffered under Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, presenting an important external confirmation. This non-Christian testimony is crucial for validating the historical event and consequently the historical figure of Jesus. Another factor that supports the reality of the crucifixion is the impact this event had on Jesus' first followers. The violent death of their leader could have extinguished the movement, but on the contrary, it boosted the faith of the first Christians who began to proclaim Jesus' resurrection. This radical transformation in the followers' behavior indicates that something real and powerful had happened, strengthening the idea that the crucifixion was a historical fact. Thus, the crucifixion is not just a religious narrative, but an event that fits perfectly into the Roman historical context, recognized by multiple sources and decisive for the real existence of Jesus. Another essential element in proving the historical existence of Jesus Christ are the reports of his appearances after death, especially the resurrection, which transformed his followers and consolidated the Christian movement. Although theological interpretations vary, the fact that hundreds of people claimed to have seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion is a historical fact that needs to be carefully considered. These collective testimonies are documented in various New Testament sources, such as the Gospels and Paul's letters. The resurrection, more than a miracle, is an event that explains the radical change in the lives of the disciples who went from being fearful to courageous proclaimers of Jesus' message, even in the face of persecution and death. The historical value of this phenomenon lies in the reaction of the witnesses who were willing to risk everything for a belief they claimed to have personally experienced. This conviction suggests a real and impactful experience, difficult to attribute to an invention or fraud. In addition, the empty tomb is a central point in the narratives, and no enemy or authority of the time publicly contested the empty tomb narrative, which would be a logical strategy if they wanted to disprove the Christian movement. The absence of Jesus' body reinforces the uniqueness of the event and generates historical debates that confirm its importance. It is also important to note that the account of the resurrection does not appear only in an isolated text, but is a widely shared belief recorded by multiple independent sources within early Christianity, indicating that this event profoundly marked the history of the first followers. As a result, the resurrection appears as a key element in understanding why Jesus' existence is so widely accepted, not just as a historical figure, but as a turning point that has shaped faith and human history. Non-Christian historical sources also provide important evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, reinforcing the reliability of the biblical accounts from perspectives outside Christianity. Ancient Roman and Jewish historians, such as Flavius, Josephus, Tacitus, and Suetonius, mention Jesus and the early Christians in their writings, corroborating their real presence on the historical scene in the first century. These mentions are crucial because they come from authors who were not interested in promoting the Christian faith, but rather in recording facts relevant to their societies. Flavius Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian, made 2 references to Jesus in his work Jewish Antiquities. The best-known passage, called Testimonium Flavianum, describes Jesus as a wise man who performed extraordinary deeds and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Despite debates about possible Christian interpolations in this text, most scholars agree that Josephus did indeed mention Jesus, offering an important external validation to the biblical narrative. Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, also quoted Jesus in his Annals, reporting that Christ suffered under Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. This reference is one of the oldest and most reliable Roman sources confirming the historical existence of Jesus, reinforcing that his crucifixion was an event recognized even outside Christian circles. Suetonius, another Roman historian, mentioned Christians and their practices, providing a historical context for the rapid expansion of Christianity. This external evidence, coming from different independent authors, shows that Jesus was not just a legendary figure, but someone who really lived, being recognized and commented on by contemporary authorities. With this, non-Christian sources broaden the historical picture of Jesus, adding credibility and corroborating the accounts found in the Gospels. Another important aspect of proving the existence of Jesus Christ lies in the writings of the early church fathers, who were leaders and theologians of the 1st and 2nd centuries who helped consolidate the Christian faith and left precious testimonies about Jesus. These texts, written shortly after Jesus' life, reflect an oral and written tradition that confirms his existence and the central importance he had for these emerging communities. Authors such as Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Justin Martyr mention Jesus directly, recounting his teachings, his death and resurrection, and the impact he had on his followers. These texts are fundamental because they were written by people who lived very close to the time of the events and had no reason to invent such an influential and transformative figure. In addition, The writings of the Church Fathers often cite earlier sources and oral testimonies that circulated among the early Christians, showing that the figure of Jesus was widely recognized and revered, and that his existence was an indisputable fact for these communities. The insistence on reporting his life and teachings demonstrates historical certainty and the depth of the impact he made. These documents also serve to show the continuity and preservation of the memory of Jesus from the earliest years of Christianity, indicating that the Christian tradition is based on a real figure whose existence has been confirmed by multiple generations of devoted followers. Finally, to consolidate the real evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, we must look at the historical and cultural impact he has had over the centuries. No historical figure has generated such a powerful movement, which has changed not only religions, but also shaped politics, culture, ethics, and the thinking of billions of people to this day. This lasting impact is an indirect but forceful testimony to the reality of this person. Christianity, born out of the preaching and life of Jesus, spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire and the ancient world, despite facing severe persecution. This extraordinary growth could hardly have taken place around a myth or a fable. The radical transformation of individuals, families, and entire societies shows that something real and profound happened, an encounter with a concrete historical figure. Furthermore, the existence of various denominations, the building of churches, the production of theological and philosophical texts, and the influence on laws and customs reflect a historical continuity that points to a true and impactful origin: Jesus of Nazareth. His legacy remains alive, studied, and debated all over the world, being part of history documented in a unique way. So even though there may be some doubts, all the historical, archaeological, documentary, and cultural evidence builds a solid picture that confirms the existence of Jesus Christ as a real person, whose life and teachings have forever marked humanity. This is the final point of our analysis, bringing to light the strength of the evidence and the importance of this character for the history of the world. In addition to all the documentary and historical evidence, it is essential to remember that modern archaeology is continually reinforcing the context in which Jesus lived. Excavations in Jerusalem, Nazareth, and other regions of Judea reveal details of daily life, architecture, religious practices, and customs that coincide with the biblical accounts. These archaeological finds help to create a concrete scenario, showing that the cities, routes, and places mentioned in the Gospels were real and inhabited at the time Jesus would have lived. For example, finds such as ossuaries with inscriptions in Aramaic, ancient synagogues, and coins from the period help to validate the environments described, while evidence about the social and political structure of the region confirms the existence of the authorities mentioned, such as Pontius Pilate and the Jewish and Roman customs that influenced Jesus' ministry. This intersection between archaeology and biblical history strengthens the picture that Jesus was a historical figure inserted in a real and documented context. Another point that deserves attention is the persistence of the oral tradition and its transition to written texts, which demonstrates a natural and reliable process of transmitting stories. Jewish culture valued the oral preservation of history and teachings, and the early Christians continued this tradition by communicating the life and messages of Jesus before recording them in writing. The speed with which the Gospels were written, compared to other texts of the time, reinforces the authenticity of the narratives. This combination of archaeology, oral tradition, and written documentation creates a multidimensional panorama that strengthens the historicity of Jesus. Another aspect that reinforces the historicity of Jesus is the critical analysis of the New Testament manuscripts. Unlike many ancient documents that come down to us in single, fragmented copies, the biblical texts have thousands of ancient manuscripts that allow for a fairly accurate reconstruction of the original content. This textual abundance is an important differentiator as it enables scholars to verify the consistency and authenticity of the information about Jesus. In addition, the short interval between the events of Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels contributes to their historical reliability. In general, these documents were written in the decades immediately following his death, which reduces the chance of distortions, myths, or inventions developed over time. This indicates that the accounts reflect living memories and authentic traditions preserved by the first Christians. Another point is that the New Testament does not exempt the accounts from internal criticism, including details that could be seen as embarrassing for the first followers, such as doubts, failures, and conflicts. The presence of this information tends to reinforce the credibility of the material, as it would hardly be invented by followers trying to promote an idealized narrative. Thus, the apparent honesty of the texts increases confidence in the existence of Jesus as a real character. In addition to the manuscripts and oral tradition, another decisive point for confirming the historical existence of Jesus lies in the diversity of the accounts about him. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written by different authors, in different contexts, and from different perspectives. Despite these differences, they all converge on the same central figure, Jesus of Nazareth, his ministry, death, and the message that transformed his followers. This convergence between multiple independent sources reinforces the veracity of the events narrated. If Jesus were an invention, it would be unlikely that so many different authors, with different motivations, would create such a consistent story. The diversity of voices shows that Jesus was a recognized figure whose impact transcended the barrier of a single group or ideology. Furthermore, Paul's letters, which are some of the oldest Christian texts, make reference to Jesus as a real person who lived, suffered, and rose again. Paul mentions personal encounters with Jesus after the resurrection, which suggests that Jesus was not just a symbolic figure, but someone whose existence was witnessed by his first followers. Therefore, the plurality of sources and the coherence between them contribute to the strength of the historical proof of the existence of Jesus Christ. Another fundamental point to confirm the historical existence of Jesus is the rapid spread of Christianity in the decades following his death. Without technology, social networks, or modern means of communication, this expansion would only have been possible if a real charismatic person had left a living, transformative legacy. The cities of the Roman Empire, such as Rome, Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus, saw the emergence of Christian communities that kept the memory and teachings of Jesus alive. This accelerated growth was met with strong resistance, including violent persecution from the Roman and Jewish authorities. If Jesus were just a mythological figure, it is unlikely that his followers would have been so dedicated as to sacrifice their lives and radically transform their own identities to keep the Christian message alive. This willingness to suffer and die for a cause indicates the real and impactful existence of the leader who inspired them. In addition, historical documents indicate that the first Christian communities sought to preserve the authenticity of Jesus' message, combating heresies and false versions that emerged. This concern shows that the followers considered the events linked to Jesus to be concrete facts and essential to their faith, and not mere fantasy. This reinforces the idea that Jesus was a real historical figure and central to the identity of the first Christians. It is also important to note that the existence of eyewitnesses and the possibility of verifying the accounts helped to guarantee the authenticity of the facts about Jesus. Many of the people who lived with him were still alive when the first texts were written, which created an atmosphere of public conference. Any distortion or invention would have been easily challenged by those who were present at the events described. This social verification factor acted as a control mechanism to preserve the fidelity of the stories. Christian communities were small and close-knit, and the oral sharing of Jesus' memories was a living and constant thing. This meant that accounts of his life, his miracles, and his crucifixion could not be fabricated without inconsistencies quickly becoming apparent. In addition, the insistence on historical details, such as names of people, places, approximate dates, and political events, reinforces the credibility of the accounts. The precision with which these elements are presented suggests that the authors sought to record a true story based on real facts and not just a symbolic or mythological narrative. Another element that strengthens the case for Jesus' existence is the direct influence he had on important historical figures of the time. Leaders, rulers, and intellectuals of the first century mentioned Jesus or had to deal with the impact of his movement. Historians like Flavius Josephus, for example, not only mention Jesus, but also highlight his reputation as a teacher and the controversy that surrounded him. These references outside the circle of Roman rulers and Jewish leaders help to insert Jesus into the official historical chronology, reinforcing that he is not just a religious figure, but an individual who was part of the political and social scene of that time. His existence caused debates, conflicts, and even changes in power that were documented independently. The reaction of the Roman authorities, such as Pontius Pilate's decision to condemn him to crucifixion, would not have happened if Jesus had been a fictional figure. This legal process, with its preserved historical details, demonstrates that Jesus was a real person confronting the power institutions of his time, which further reinforces his historicity. In addition to these historical references, another aspect that reinforces Jesus' real existence are the Old Testament prophecies that were fulfilled in his life, as recorded in the Gospels. Prophets such as Isaiah, Micah, and Daniel spoke of a messianic figure who would bring salvation, justice, and hope to the people. These texts were written centuries before Jesus, which makes it unlikely that his life was a mere coincidence. The accuracy of details, such as his birthplace in Bethlehem, his Davidic lineage, his ministry of healing and teaching, and even the manner of his death by crucifixion, correspond directly to these ancient prophecies. This suggests that Jesus was seen by his followers as the fulfillment of the promises made by God throughout Israel's history. These connections between the ancient prophecies and the events of Jesus' life create a strong picture that goes beyond faith, also touching on history and literary tradition, consolidating the image of Jesus as a person who actually existed and played a crucial role in the divine plan announced for centuries. In addition to the fulfillment of the prophecies, another crucial aspect to validate Jesus' existence lies in the social and cultural changes that his ministry brought about. Before Jesus, Jewish society was deeply divided and marked by rigid religious norms. The message of love, forgiveness, and inclusion that he preached broke with many of these traditions, attracting followers from diverse backgrounds and social classes. This social transformation, seen especially through the acceptance of Gentiles and the marginalized, is a powerful indication that Jesus' actions and words generated a real and tangible impact. The fact that so many people joined this movement, even in the face of opposition and persecution, reinforces that they were responding to a concrete historical figure whose message touched lives deeply. Furthermore, the growth of Christian communities and the development of the early church reflect an organized and sustained movement based on the life and teachings of Jesus, showing that he was not just a legendary character, but a real person who changed history forever. Another point that reinforces Jesus' historical existence is the lasting impact of his teachings, which have been passed down through the centuries and continue to influence millions of people around the world. His words and parables, documented in the Gospels, address universal themes such as love, justice, humility, and forgiveness, which resonate with the human experience in different cultures and times. This ethical and moral legacy could not have been created by a mythological figure, but by someone who lived, experienced, and taught these truths in an authentic way. The ability of his teachings to transform lives, motivate social movements, and shape values around the world is indirect but powerful evidence of his existence. Furthermore, the preservation and dissemination of the sacred texts in the face of persecution, censorship, and historical challenges shows that Jesus' followers were convinced of their reality and importance. This faith, supported by concrete historical evidence, solidifies the figure of Jesus Christ as a real person who marked the history of humanity. As we come to the end of this deep dive into the real evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ, it is clear that the sum of historical, archaeological, textual, and social evidence forms a robust and convincing picture. From independent ancient documents, through archaeological discoveries, to the rapid spread of his message and the lasting impact over thousands of years, everything points to the existence of a man who transformed history. More than a religious figure, Jesus is a historical presence whose legacy transcends borders and eras, being recognized not only by faith, but also by the rigor of the evidence that confirms his life and teachings. Understanding this reality is fundamental for those who seek not only to believe, but also to understand the context and depth of the influence he exerted on the world. Thank you for following along. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more content that explores the truth behind the stories that have marked humanity. See you next time.